Entwined with that was the emergence of what we now call the social sciences as distinct disciplines in the colleges and universities. The idea being, it's another one of those waves of taking the idea of the scientific method and applying it to things outside the natural sciences, much like Enlightenment thinkers did in the 18th century. We're back to that again. They started to apply scientific techniques, models, methods, Darwin's natural selection theory to other areas. And you end up with the disciplines of psychology and sociology and anthropology and things like political science emerging as their own distinct, unique disciplines. Okay, well, we're getting close to the end now. We'll talk a little bit about literature. The two prominent genres of American literature in the late 19th and early 20th century were realism and naturalism. Okay, you had the development of regionalist writers who wrote about regional topics, regional settings, and they wrote in regional dialect. The most famous of those, of course, is Mark Twain. Samuel Clemens, known as Mark Twain, who wrote in that sort of Missouri, sort of along the Mississippi riverboat, that area dialect in his works, like Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer. Also, Bret Harte, who wrote westerns. Okay. You also had, and that was considered realism. They wrote, and the characters in their works actually spoke like people from that given area spoke. I'm sorry. You also had naturalists really into describing in very minute detail the settings and the situations of books. People like Stephen Crane in The Red Badge of Courage. Really giving readers a real unnerving glimpse at what war and battle was really like. Jack London, Call of the Wild, and White Fang, and books like that. Also, Theodore Dreiser, who wrote a number of important works, including An American Tragedy, which I believe was published in 1908, which examined in pretty minute detail what it was like to live in these new urban areas. In painting, you also had naturalism and realism. You had people like Winslow Homer. You had James McNeill Whistler, who did his famous, Whistler's Mother, which is known as I think Study in Black and Gray, number something or other. You also had the Ashcan School, which was a group of artists who created paintings that sort of gave you this feel of this sort of gritty urban realism. We also had the first and really only significant American Impressionist painter, Mary Cassatt, who painted with pastel colors and the sort of shimmering effects that you would get from the Impressionist school, largely coming out of France. In music, you had the development of the one really, up to this point, indigenous American musical form, and that is jazz. You had, originally coming out of New Orleans, jazz being sort of the combination of African rhythms and improvisation in music, blending it in with almost Western-style musical structures and with Western instrumentation. Scott Joplin being the most famous, his Maple Leaf Rag at the turn of the century, sold about 1 million copies of sheet music. Here's an African-American publishing a piece of music, and it's a huge bestseller. Pretty much every piano player in the country wanted to play it. Blues begins to develop. Ultimately descended from the songs that the slaves would sing in the fields as they worked. And what starts to happen is, by the early 1900s, those originally, the jazz, the center of it being in New Orleans, it starts to drift out into other cities and areas in the country, into St. Louis and Kansas City, places like that. So jazz. In pop culture, you had the popular press, mass circulation newspapers. There were two figures there. First, Joseph Pulitzer, whose New York World, a lot of sensationalist crime and disaster stories, and also sort of crusading exposés uncovering political and economic corruption. The irony is he got his start, his papers often printed these sensationalist kind of or sensationalized stories, is that Pulitzer is, of course, for whom the set of awards for journalistic excellence are named. The other was William Randolph Hearst, who established a newspaper empire whose descendants are still around. Again, sensationalist, kind of lurid kind of stuff. When we talk about the Spanish-American War, we'll call it yellow journalism. You had mass circulation magazines that sold for a nickel or a dime a copy, too. Okay, finally, new types of leisure activity. You had vaudeville shows. You had the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus coming along, P.T. Barnum's amusements. You had the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, one of the biggest spectator draws there were. Also, we get the beginning of big-time spectator sports, too. Of course, the number one spectator sport, baseball, the American pastime, becomes huge after the Civil War. You get the first, the major leagues developed, the National League in 1876, and then the American League comes along in 1901. And it was very interesting in that you look at the rosters of Major League Baseball teams in the late 19th century, and they're a microcosm of ethnic America. The number of Irish immigrants and descendants of Irish immigrants who caught on in Major League Baseball was noted at the time, was unusually high. People thought that maybe perhaps the Irish were just naturally good at baseball. The most famous late 19th century team was right here, the National League Baltimore Orioles of the 1890s. Very successful and would win at all costs. He also had the invention of basketball in 1891 at Springfield, Massachusetts by James Naismith. Football at that time is still trying to evolve out of soccer and rugby, and it's not professional football, doesn't catch on till later. It's college football at this time. So there we have it. And that was a rundown of aspects of urban culture in late 19th century and early 20th century America. And that's it for Unit 8, Assignment 6. See ya.